Proselytes were heirs of the promise covenantally, not tribally or genealogically. They were heirs in the sense that they were legally incorporated into Israel, his covenant relationship with Yahweh, which is where the promise resided. The promise was never a free-floating biological entitlement. It was administered through a covenantal system consisting of law, worship, sacrifice, blessing, and curse. When a proselyte was circumcised, bound to Torah, and entered Israel's cultic life, he or she entered the very structure through which the promise operated. This is why Torah insists on one law and one statute per Numbers 15:15, 16, and allows the proselyte to keep Passover per Exodus 12:48. Participation at that level presupposes promise-bearing status because the covenant's blessings and sanctions are inseparable. Proselytes were heirs with respect to salvation, forgiveness, and life, not with respect to tribal land inheritance or genealogical succession. Scripture itself distinguishes these categories. Levites were heirs of the covenant without inheriting land in the same way as other tribes, showing that land allotment was not the exhaustive definition of the promise. Likewise, proselytes did not inherit tribal land or genealogical standing, but they did inherit the covenant's redemptive benefits: access to God, atonement through sacrifice, inclusion in Israel's worship, and accountability to covenant judgment. Those are precisely the realities Paul later identifies as the substance of the promise. Proselytes were also heirs by reckoning, not by biology. Paul makes explicit what Torah already implied: the promise is reckoned by faith so that it may rest on grace, per Romans 4:16. Reckoning is an accounting category, not a genetic one. This is why Paul can say that those who belong to Christ are Abraham's seed and heirs according to promise, per Galatians 3:29, without implying that anyone becomes a biological descendant of Abraham. Proselytes fit this logic perfectly. They were counted within Israel's covenant family through allegiance, oath, and faithfulness, not blood. Proselytes were heirs within Israel, not apart from Israel. They did not replace Israel, form a new people, or receive a separate promise. They became part of Israel's covenantal household and therefore shared in Israel's hope. This is why Scripture can say you stand today, all of you, before the Lord your God, the native, and the sojourner, per Deuteronomy 29:10-15, when reaffirming the covenant. The promise belonged to Israel. Proselytes became heirs precisely because they joined Israel covenantally. In short, proselytes were heirs of the promise as covenant members who shared in Israel's redemptive blessings, not as tribal landholders or biological descendants. That is not a later theological invention. It is how the biblical covenant system itself functioned. While Israel's election originated through Abraham's physical seed, the law repeatedly states that the covenant's rights, obligations, and promises applied equally to the native-born Israelite and the circumcised foreigner who bound himself to Yahweh. Exodus 12:48-49, Numbers 15:15-16, and Deuteronomy 29:10-6 place the proselyte under the same covenant jurisdiction, cultic obligations, and sanctions as Israel. As Jacob Milgram explains, the proselyte is fully subject to the covenant and its cultic requirements. Participation in sacrifice presupposes covenant membership. Source: Milgram, Leviticus 1-16, Anchor Yale Bible. In other words, the Torah never treats proselytes as peripheral participants. Covenant, incorporation, not bloodline, was the operative criterion for promise-bearing status. By the Second Temple period, proselytes were widely understood as Gentiles by origin who had become Jews by covenant. Shea J.D. Cohen states this succinctly: a proselyte is a Gentile who has become a Jew. Source: The Beginnings of Jewishness, page 140. Conversion involved circumcision, acceptance of Torah, and participation in Israel's cultic life, precisely the markers associated with covenant standing. Because the promise was administered through Israel's covenant structure, those who lawfully entered that structure were treated as legitimate participants in Israel's hope. As E. P. Sanders notes, proselytes were required to keep the law and were liable to punishment for its violation, just as native Israelites were. Source: Judaism, Practice and Belief, page 171. Liability to covenant sanctions presupposes eligibility for covenant blessings. Proselytes' inclusion as heirs of the promise is inseparable from their cultic access and participation, which Scripture and scholarship consistently affirm. Baruch Levine observes that Numbers 15 grants the proselyte full participation in the sacrificial cult, governed by the same ritual requirements as the native Israelite. Source: Numbers 120, Anchor, Yale Bible. Sacrificial participation, Passover observance, per Exodus 12:48, and being subject to being cut off are not symbolic gestures, they are promise-bearing realities tied to covenant membership. This is why Michael Fishbane can say, circumcision functioned as the ritual act by which the foreigner was incorporated into Israel's covenant community. Source: Fishbane, Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel. Once incorporated, the proselyte was no longer treated as a Gentile for covenantal purposes. The New Testament assumes and builds upon this covenantal logic rather than overturning it. Paul's claim that the promise is reckoned by faith in Romans 4:16 does not invent a new category. It explains how covenant inheritance functioned so that the promise would rest on grace rather than genealogy. This is precisely why Paul can speak of those formerly called ethnos as now adopted as sons and heirs according to promise, without redefining Israel out of existence or turning Gentiles into metaphysical Israelites. As N.T. Wright notes, Paul's argument presupposes a Jewish world where membership in the people of God was always a matter of covenant faithfulness rather than mere ethnic descent. Source: Paul and the faithfulness of God. Proselytes were included as recipients of the promise because they were covenantally joined to Israel, and the promise belonged to Israel's covenant, not to biology alone. This is supported by the Scriptures, scholars, and by history. What follows is a brief prolepsis, which is a set of anticipated arguments answered in advance. Here are the strongest objections typically raised against the claim that proselytes were heirs of the promise, stated fairly, followed by brief notes on why each objection ultimately fails. Framing them this way will help you anticipate and dismantle pushback rather than talk past it. 1. Proselytes lacked land inheritance, therefore they were not heirs of the promise. Objection: the Abrahamic promise includes land, seed, and nationhood. Since proselytes could not inherit tribal land or be enrolled in genealogical registries, they could not be true heirs of the promise. This objection conflates tribal inheritance with covenant inheritance, treating land allotment as the exhaustive definition of the promise. Why it's weak. Scripture itself distinguishes land tenure from covenant standing. Levites lacked tribal land but were unquestionably covenant heirs. Likewise, many Israelites died in the wilderness without land, yet remained heirs of the promise. The promise includes land but is not exhausted by land. 2. The promise was to Abraham and his seed, and seed means biological descendants. Objection: Genesis repeatedly frames the promise as passing through Abraham's physical offspring. Therefore, only those biologically descended can inherit it. This objection treats origin language as prescriptive identity language. Why it's weak. Even in Genesis, seed is selectively reckoned like Isaac over Ishmael. Paul makes this explicit by defining seed covenantally in Romans 9:6-8 and Galatians 3:16-29. If seed were purely biological, Paul's argument collapses into a tautology of if you're Abraham's descendants, then you're Abraham's descendants. 3. Proselytes were covenant participants, not covenant heirs. Objection. Proselytes could participate in Israel's law and cult, but were not heirs of the underlying promise. This objection attempts to create a two-tier covenant where obligations apply equally, but inheritance does not. Why it's weak. Participation in sacrifice, Passover, and covenant sanctions presupposes promise-bearing status. Scripture never defines a category of people fully bound by the covenant, yet excluded from its promises. One law per Numbers, 15:15-16, includes blessings and curses, not merely duties. 4. The promise was national, not individual. Proselytes were attached to Israel, but not included in the promise itself. Objection. The promise belongs to Israel as a nation. Proselytes benefit secondarily, but are not themselves promise recipients. This objection is an attempt to preserve ethnic boundaries while allowing limited inclusion. Why it's weak. Scripture repeatedly applies covenant promises at the level of individuals within Israel, like forgiveness, life, blessing. Proselytes are addressed as individuals under the same covenant sanctions and blessings, which collapses the distinction. 5. Paul's inclusion language refers only to dispersed Israelites, not Gentile proselytes. Objection. When Paul speaks of ethnos being adopted or justified, he is referring only to lost Israelites, not true Gentiles. This objection allows bloodline-only models to absorb Paul's language without changing their framework. Why it's weak. Second Temple sources, Acts, and Paul himself distinguish proselytes from native Israelites while still counting them as Jews. Nicholas in Acts 6 is explicitly a proselyte, not a dispersed Israelite, yet receives the Spirit. Paul's argument only works if covenantal inclusion extends beyond biology. 6. Election was fixed before creation, so proselytes cannot be included later. Objection. If election occurred before the foundation of the world, covenant identity cannot change within history. This objection imports a deterministic metaphysical framework into the text. Why it's weak. Biblical election language describes divine purpose, not timeless biological identity. Israel becomes God's son at the Exodus. Paul's adoption language assumes covenantal change over time, not pre-cosmic fixation. 7. Proselytes are never explicitly called heirs in the Old Testament. Objection. If proselytes were heirs of the promise, Scripture would say so explicitly. This argument relies on silence. Why it's weak. Scripture rarely labels anyone explicitly as heirs of the promise. Heirship is inferred from covenant standing, cultic access, and sanction. The New Testament makes the inference explicit, per Romans 4:16 and Galatians 3:29. 8. Including proselytes undermines Israel's distinctiveness. Objection. If non-Israelites can receive the promise, Israel's uniqueness is erased. This objection is often driven by identity anxiety rather than textual evidence. Why it's weak. Proselytes did not replace Israel or dissolve her identity, they joined Israel. Israel remains the covenant bearer. Proselytes participate through Israel, not apart from her. Every major objection depends on equating covenant inheritance with biology or treating origin texts as permanent identity rules. Once Scripture's own distinctions between origin, covenant standing, participation, and inheritance are respected, the objections lose their force.